On October 3rd, 1887, dawn came to Sage Hollow, Wyoming Territory, with a hard north wind and a thermometer reading of 28 degrees at the post office wall, and by full light the settlement's 312 souls had already arranged themselves into the habits that kept pride alive on the frontier. Men at hitch rails speaking of cattle weights and rail timetables, women trading yeast starts and lamp wicks, children sent with pails before breakfast, and every eye turning sooner or later toward Ezra Kincaid's mercantile porch, because credit in winter was often worth more than coin in autumn. The town stretched along one wagon road, shallow and rutted from summer freight, with cabins and barns shouldered close, as if timber itself feared open ground. Beyond the last fenced lot, where the road bent near a dry wash, a wind-scoured acre lay mostly bare except for wiry bunch grass and 2 cottonwoods bent permanently east. Ranchers had passed on that parcel for 11 years, saying the land split itself in two whenever drifts came, one channel toward the wash, another back across the lane. That morning, Wayne Graham and his younger sister Mercy walked it from corner stake to corner stake, boots sinking in dust that had already crusted at the surface, and paid $19 for ground no one else would hold through January. Friend, tell us in the comments where you are watching from today, whether your winters come with mountain snow or open plains wind that rattles windows through the night. Subscribe now so you do not miss what happens when frontier caution collides with frontier pride. Wayne Graham was 29 that autumn, broad through the shoulders from saw work and cordwood, with a wind-burned face that gave strangers the false impression of impatience, while Mercy, 22, carried herself with deliberate calm, learned from years of listening before speaking in rooms where older voices expected to be obeyed. They had come south from the Lake Superior country 2 winters earlier, after their mother, Ino Graham, died in January fever that turned in 3 days from cough to silence, leaving behind not money but notebooks, habits, and measurements written in Finnish and careful English in a hand that remained steady even near the end. Ino had crossed Lake Superior ice as a girl in a convoy of timber sleds, had seen horses freeze standing when men trusted distance more than weather, and taught her children that winter did not defeat families in one dramatic hour. Winter defeated them by fatigue, moisture, and poor movement between heat and cold. Her instruction had not been mystical and not sentimental. It was practical, repeated, and tested. She taught that a stove could fail, but routines could not be allowed to fail with it. She taught that one large room invited one large mistake. Wet coats steaming near bedding, ash scattered where children slept, fever carried from pallet to pallet because there was nowhere to separate the sick from the tired. She taught that walls mattered, but gaps and passages mattered more, because transition was where heat was either preserved or squandered. During storms on Superior's South Shore, she had worked with families who built paired sheds connected by tight plank runs, and she remembered which designs kept milk from freezing, which roof pitches held under drift load, which door placements prevented cross gusts from stripping a room in 1 minute. By the second week of October, Wayne had recited those lessons to Mercy often enough that they became work songs without melody. They rented a room in town while planning their own build, taking occasional labor from the mill to keep cash in hand, yet setting aside nearly every spare dollar for nails, oilcloth, stovepipe, and lime. Their full ledger for that month survived in Mercy's script: $19 for land, $46 for milled boards and rough joists from Hawkins Mill, $11.60 for 2 cast-iron stoves bought used from a freighter bound north, $3.40 for hinge sets and latch iron, $2.10 for tar and pitch, $7 for 12 panes of thick glass, each 10 by 14 inches, $1.80 for rope and pulley hardware, $5.20 for limestone and sand to seal joints at ground level, They did not buy paint. Sage Hollow did not object to thrift. Sage Hollow objected to visible refusal of local custom. A family that built one rectangular cabin, one stove, one loft, and one attached lean-to was considered sensible. A family that announced plans for 2 cabins on 1 acre, with open space deliberately held between them, was considered touched by anxiety. When Wayne submitted his rough site sketch at the clerk's desk, showing 2 structures, 14 by 18 feet each with a measured 22-foot corridor between sill lines, the clerk asked whether he had mistaken feet for inches. Wayne answered that he had not. Mercy asked for the copy to be filed as drawn. The source of their certainty was neither vanity nor quarrelsome temperament. It was grief made disciplined. Eno Graham had died in a single cabin dwelling where wet wool hung over chairs 3 feet from bedding, where a coughing child and a sleeping elder shared the same stale air, where one failed stovepipe seam filled the room with smoke at midnight and forced everyone into the yard in sleet. Wayne had been there. Mercy had carried hot stones from the firebox in her apron to warm frozen boots. Their mother, too weak to stand, had still told them what to remember. Build for day 7, not day 1. Build for wet and tired hands. Build for the moment between out there and in here. In 40 words, she left an engineering principle and an ethic. Work began on October 12th, under a sky so clear the distant ridges looked cut from tin. Wayne set 4 corner stakes for the south cabin first, then 4 for the north, pulling diagonal lines until each rectangle measured true within less than 1 inch of square. Mercy marked the 22-foot interval between thresholds with whitewash on packed dirt, then drove temporary pegs every 4 feet down the center line where the future passage would run. They dug post holes to 38 inches, below ordinary frost depth for that basin, and tamped base stone with sledge and iron rod until each post sat without wobble. The cabins rose on separate sill frames, each frame mortised and pinned, because the siblings intended the 2 structures to move independently under load rather than transmit strain through a rigid shared wall. 3 boys from Willow Lane watched for an afternoon and reported to their fathers that the Grahams were building with a street in the middle. By supper, the description had become entertainment at Kincaid's store counter. Ezra Kincaid was 43, smooth-cheeked and broad-waisted from success, with polished boots, wool coat imported from St. Louis, and hands almost never chapped because he counted inventory more often than he handled rope. His ledgers determined whose account was renewed after poor harvest and whose account was closed until cash appeared. He stood beneath his hanging scale and said loudly enough for flour customers, harness buyers, and 2 teamsters to hear, if Caution paid rent, Wayne Graham would own this territory. He has built himself a lane for Wynn to run races. Call it Graham's Folly Alley and be done. The line traveled faster than freight. By October 20th, children shouted Folly Alley when passing the site, and 2 carpenters declined paid day work there after Kincaid remarked that he would remember who encouraged panic building. Wayne and Mercy adjusted. They hired no crews, worked from first light until lantern time, and divided labor by precision rather than custom. Wayne cut and set rafters at a steep winter pitch of 10 and 12, with extra collar ties every 30 inches to resist drift load. Mercy sealed sill joints with lime mortar mixed stiff, then banked earth against exterior walls in an 18-inch berm to reduce wind scour at floor level. They framed door openings on the corridor sides first, not the street sides, signaling that movement between cabins was the design's heart, not a later convenience. On October the 21st, they shifted from framing to systems. Wayne installed overhead line posts across the open interval, each post capped with an iron eye so ropes could be strung above shoulder height when storms blinded ground markers. Mercy measured clearance in the middle run for stretcher passage, marking 6 feet free width between planned sod walls and noted where stove barrels, Kindling bins and water casks could be staged without blocking traffic. They chose double doors for both car door ends, with offset swings so one leaf could never be held open by a single gust through the whole passage. They dug a shallow trench beneath the center line for root storage, intending later to line it with plank and straw so potatoes and turnips remained above freeze point, even when surface drifts hardened to stone. By the last week of October, while cottonwood leaves skittered low and cattle shifted restlessly in their pens at sundown, the two cabins stood framed against the wash, and the corridor skeleton stretched between them like a promise few in town respected. Kincaid's nickname had become social shorthand for fear dressed as craftsmanship, but the Grahams kept their measurements, their receipts, and their sequence of tasks, and each evening Mercy entered the day's progress in a ledger that left no line uncertain. The work was not decorative. The work was a wager with winter. On October 21st, 1887, before sunrise had fully lifted over the bent cottonwoods by the wash, the thermometer nailed to the south cabin post read 34 degrees, though the previous afternoon had touched 61, and the sudden softness that had made half the town laugh at winter preparations now carried a sharp contradiction that Wayne trusted more than the number itself. The geese did not fly high in clean lines that morning. They moved low and broken, beating south in uneven skeins as if pressed downward by weight above them. In the cattle pens behind Willow Lane, steers stood rump to the north and held still through feed call. Mercy checked the barometer on their crate-built workbench, tapped the glass once with her fingernail, and read the needle drop against marks Wayne had copied from Ino's notebook. Their mother had named that pattern in plain terms: the quiet before iron wind. Wayne saddled and rode to Kincaid's store with frost still silver on the ruts. He did not shout, and he did not soften the warning. He told the room that coal, lamp oil, flour, and salt pork should be bought at once because a hard cycle was setting. He told ranch hands to bed animals deeper and move water barrels inside. He told mothers to dry mittens in pairs and keep one set sealed in oilcloth. Ezra Kincaid stood near the flour scale in a dark vest that fit tightly over a prosperous middle, glanced at the line, then at Wayne, and raised his prices before the hour ended. Flour moved from 24 cents to 41 cents per pound. Coal allotments were cut to cash sales. Kerosene was held behind the counter. Kincaid said, with a smile that asked the room to join him, that Wayne Graham was trying to frighten business into his ditch camp at Folly Alley. By noon, 3 separate telegraph breaks west of Cheyenne were reported at the station office, and by dusk a rail hand coming in from Granite Falls said drifts had already begun to bridge ties in the cutbanks. Sage Hollow had heard storm warnings before and watched them pass. This report had a different structure. Not one squall, but pressure, wind and transport failure arriving together. Wayne returned to the build site and changed the work sequence without debate. Decorative trim was abandoned. Window casings were left rough. Every remaining hour went to function. 3 days passed before any telegraph continuity returned, and when a signal did come through, it was partial and delayed, enough only to confirm that freight schedules would slip and coal wagons would not meet their usual intervals. During that same span, Wayne and Mercy purchased the last affordable nails in town at $3 per keg, minutes before Kincaid posted another increase. They hauled 2 kegs by handcart through the afternoon mud, stacked them in the north cabin, and drew a new corridor plan in charcoal directly on the plank floor. The passage between cabins had first been laid out as open transfer ground. It now became a sealed system. Wayne set paired posts at 4-foot spacing down both corridor lines and notched them to receive top plates 8 feet high, then framed a low-pitch roof that she'd drift to the lee side rather than into the walkway. Mercy mixed clay, straw, and chopped bunchgrass for chinking, while he fastened side sheathing in staggered seams to break direct gust channels. They built double-door assemblies at each end with offset orientation, so one door could be opened while the second remained closed, creating an airlock that protected interior heat. Under the center run, they deepened the root trench to 32 inches, lined it with planks scavenged from freight crates, and capped it with removable slats over straw and burlap, testing by lantern light how quickly ground chill climbed through each layer. By the last week of October, the siblings had turned labor into a strict rotation that treated fatigue as a hazard equal to wind. The south cabin became stores and treatment space, never sleeping space, with shelves fixed to wall studs so jars could not topple when doors slammed under pressure. The north cabin became sleeping quarters only, with bedding rolled and stowed by daylight to keep floor area clear for emergency cots. The rule was absolute. Wet garments were removed in the corridor, never carried to sleeping pallets, and boots were inverted over a stove rack in the south cabin, so thaw water remained away from blankets. Mercy enforced the ledger as rigorously as any quartermaster. She listed not only items but location and freeze risk, writing, for example, 22 pounds of oats in pine pitch barrel, north wall, elevated 6 inches, 4 tins camphor and willow bark, south shelf, 3, cloth wrapped, lamp oil 8 gallons, corridor chest, latch secured, in the first week of November with daytime highs near 39 and nights sinking to 15. Wayne installed rope lines from corridor door to woodstack, from corridor door to pump, and from corridor door to the small stock shelter where they kept 2 goats and a mule borrowed against spring labor. The lines were anchored to waist-high posts sunk below frost line, then tensioned and tested with blindfold walks. Mercy timed each crossing under different wind angles and marked distances in paces for those unfamiliar with the ground. A blinded walker could leave shelter, follow braid by touch, and return without sight. She taught the method to 2 widowers on the next lane. One thanked her quietly. The other asked whether Kincaid would close his account if he was seen learning at Folly Alley. Kincaid's pressure moved through town by ledger rather than law, but it carried equal force. Families seeking winter credit were asked direct questions at the mercantile counter. Had they worked for the Grahams? Had they lent tools? Had their children been attending Mercy's reading circle behind the church shed on Thursdays? By mid-November, 6 children had been withdrawn from that circle, and one mother, eyes lowered to the flour sack she carried, told Mercy that the lessons were valued, but the account at the store was more urgent than letters in winter. Mercy nodded and said there was no debt between them. She stacked wood until her gloves went stiff with pitch, then returned to cutting bandage strips from worn linen. On November 18th, a Sunday wind came out of the northwest all day, without changing once, and by dusk even skeptics had begun to bank extra ash around stove bases. Wayne met mockery at the hitch rail near the post office when 2 ranch hands called across the mud that his alley was ready for parade use and asked whether he would charge a toll. He lifted the rope coil from his shoulder, set it in the wagon bed without answering, and kept walking. Later, as Mercy recorded kerosene use, he said the only sentence he would offer on the matter: "Let them talk. Wind does not bargain with pride." He did not repeat it again. By the 3rd week of November, procurement itself had become a tactical exercise. Kincaid limited salt pork to 2 pounds per household per week, except at premium cash rate, and he held back coffee entirely for favored ranch accounts. Wayne adjusted by purchasing dried beans, whole oats, and coarse cornmeal from a freighter's widow on the East Edge, paying $11.70 for mixed stores that required longer boiling but stretched farther. Mercy rendered tallow and poured emergency candles in reused tins, each marked for 4-hour burn. They smoked trout obtained from 2 trappers delayed near Coldwater and packed strips in cloth bags layered with salt. They built a broth schedule measured to fuel cost, Morning kettle from dawn to 8, evening kettle from 4 to 7, never continuous simmer unless fever cases required it. The first true snow came thin on November 24th, hardly more than a whitening, and the town took comfort from its gentleness. Kincaid reopened credit to several households at terms favorable to himself and remarked that panic had passed. Wayne did not answer. He reinforced the corridor roof with diagonal braces at each third post and added interior pegs for hanging soaked outerwear away from stove spark range. Mercy stitched canvas partitions that could divide the south cabin into 2 treatment bays if lung sickness spread. They tested door procedures with mittens on, because bare-handed latches were no use at minus temperatures. 4 days later, a warm wind returned briefly and turned the street slush to brown water. Men on the mercantile porch said winter had broken before it had begun. That evening, as clouds built low and fast from the north, and the barometer needle fell again with greater speed than in October, Wayne walked the lane from wash to church and marked households with chalk, not for judgment but for triage priority. Infants, elders, known chest illness, limited fuel, no draft animal. Mercy copied the list and wrapped it in waxed cloth. They were preparing for rescue work now, not household comfort. At dawn on December 3rd, the reading at the post office wall stood at minus 18 degrees, and wind drove fine snow nearly horizontal past the hitch rails. By noon, gusts were clocked near 55 miles per hour by the railmen before they abandoned the yard and sheltered. The road disappeared first, then fence lines, then doorsteps. Kincaid's large fronted house, admired all autumn for its broad windows and polished trim, showed ferned ice along interior glass before nightfall. At the Graham's place, the corridor doors opened and closed in sequence, one at a time, as planned. Snow was beaten from coats in the transfer space. Gloves were changed there. Heat was held where sleep would occur. Movement became method. Method became survival. Movement became method. Method became survival. Through that first blizzard day, while wind struck the corridor roof in hard, repeating blows, Wayne and Mercy treated their own system as unfinished work rather than completed shelter, because every hour exposed a weakness that ordinary weather had concealed. Wayne noticed frost feathering along the upper latch seam of the west door and packed it with wool felt cut from an old saddle blanket, then fixed a second interior batten to keep the plank from flexing under gust pressure. Mercy found thaw water pooling beneath the bench where boots were inverted, so she bored 2 drain holes through the corridor floor slats and set a gravel catch below, preventing ice glaze where tired feet would soon move quickly. Nothing was assumed. Nothing was left to memory. By afternoon, the temperature dropped to minus 22 degrees, and the north cabin stove began drawing poorly when both corridor doors were opened within the same minute. Wayne climbed the lee side ladder in blowing grain snow, lengthened the stovepipe by 18 inches with spare section tin, and added a wire cowl to break downdraft. Inside, Mercy shifted sleeping pallets 1 handspan farther from the outer wall. After finding rime under 2 bedrolls at dawn, she hung canvas from ceiling pegs to create a narrow dead-air pocket between pallets and planking, then measured interior temperatures every 2 hours with Ino's spirit thermometer. 54 near stove, 47 at floor center, 39 at wall edge before the canvas, 44 after. The numbers governed where elders were laid and where children were never laid. On December 4th, with wind still near 40 miles per hour and no wagon movement anywhere on the main road, the siblings expanded the corridor into a true intake lane for more than their own household. Wayne fixed 3 horizontal rails to the south wall at chest, waist, and knee height, so a person half frozen could brace while outer layers were cut free or unlaced. Mercy arranged treatment order in chalk above the work table. Dry first, warm second, broth third, sleep forth, and no one crossed into north cabin bedding with wet wool. She boiled stones in stove ash and wrapped them in flannel for foot warming, because direct fire heat cracked skin already numbed. She labeled each shelf with plain tags: cough syrups, willow bark, camphor rub, fever cloths, lamp reserve, lye soap. Even Panic could read labels. By the second evening of storm, Wayne began a fuel ledger beside Mercy's ration book. One split cottonwood stick, seasoned and cut to 16 inches, burned an average of 26 minutes in the south stove dampered low, 19 minutes dampered high. Pine kindling ignited quickly but wasted heat unless paired with hardwood. Coal remained scarce and was reserved for midnight stability. He calculated that at current use they held 13 days of secure burn in both cabins, 18 if corridor occupancy rose and sleeping space stayed closed to all but the weakest. He shortened every argument to arithmetic. Mercy shortened every request to task. When a neighbor arrived asking for extra lamp oil until roads clear, she was handed 1 pint and a written return date, then taught how to trim wick height so flame did not smoke away half the supply. The town did not become humble in a single night. On December 5th, when snowfall eased enough for voices to carry lane to lane, mockery returned in a thinner, sharper form, because pride had been chilled but not yet broken. 2 men sheltering at Kincaid's porch shouted across the drifted street that Wayne had turned his place into a barracks for worriers and asked whether he planned to charge by the blanket. A woman whose family still had coal stacked in dry shed said loudly that Mercy had always preferred lists to living and now had a ledger for breathing. Ezra Kincaid, hands still gloved in good leather while others wore patched wool, remarked to 3 customers that fear built small houses and called it wisdom after the fact. The line was carried by evening to the pump queue. Even hunger preserved hierarchy until hunger deepened. Kincaid's influence hardened from rumor into sanction. Families who had accepted small aid from the Grahams found their store credit under review, a phrase that meant no flour on account and no kerosene except cash at storm rates. On December 6th, Seth Brannick, who had borrowed Wayne's auger in October, was denied lamp oil after admitting he had helped tension rope posts in November. He walked back through knee-deep drift with an empty can and a face set in that exhausted stillness men wore when anger could not be afforded. Mercy met him at the corridor door, poured him 1 quart from reserve, and entered his name in the return book without witness and without commentary. Wayne later hauled a half sled of split wood to Brannick's yard, stacked it by the lee wall, and left before the family came outside. By the morning of December the 7th, a fragile calm settled over Sage Hollow. Sky pale as tin and wind reduced to a whisper along fence tops. Many took that quiet as release. Kincaid reopened his front door wide and resumed private sales from dwindling shelves, charging 58 cents per pound for flour now that rail delay had become certainty. He told those gathered that the worst had passed and that prudent men conserved reputation as carefully as fuel. In his tone lay a warning against crossing social lines already drawn. Mercy heard the message repeated by a church elder who advised mothers not to bring children near Folly Alley, lest alarm become habit. Yet those same mothers sent older sons at dusk for broth under excuse of errand, and the boys learned to enter silently, hang coats where told, warm hands, and leave with covered tins. Wayne answered none of it in public. He worked. He shoveled drift away from corridor doors to full hinge swing each dawn and dusk, then marked the cleared path edges with willow wands, dipped in lamp black, so wide-out travelers could find the entrance when rope lines disappeared under fresh accumulation. He added a pulley point beneath the corridor ridge beam for hoisting stove barrels or lifting a collapsed walker without 4 men crowding the lane. Mercy taught 3 neighboring women how to rotate drying racks, so mittens never scorched and never froze stiff at cuff. She restarted her reading circle in altered form, not letters and verse, but ration math, match conservation, and fever watch intervals. The children who came did not laugh. They copied numbers carefully with charcoal on cratewood and repeated procedures aloud until they could recite them while buttoning coats with numb fingers. On December 8th, warning signs returned in a pattern Wayne recognized, and most others dismissed. Ravens flew low and inland before noon, leaving carrion scraps untouched at the stock pens. The mule in the Graham's lean shelter refused grain and stood with ears pinned toward the north for 2 hours straight. Fine snow from roof edges fell not downward, but sideways in sudden sheets, though ground wind remained mild. Mercy checked the barometer at 3-hour intervals and recorded a steep, steady drop, sharper than 21st October. When sunlight pierced briefly through high haze, a pale ring formed around it, then doubled inner and outer halos before vanishing into building cloud. Aino had taught them that such light rings in dry cold often preceded wind with force enough to strip eaves. That afternoon, Wayne rode as far as drifts allowed to Kincaid's store, and then to the church shed, giving the same warning in each place. Another push was forming, colder and longer than the first, and Holmes should consolidate fuel, move vulnerable sleepers into inner rooms, and set touch lines from door to woodpile before dark. He offered rope, stakes, and labor to any household willing to rig guides. At Kincaid's counter, where shelves now showed empty spaces between salt sacks and bean tins, the merchant laughed less than before, but still chose derision over preparation. He said weathermen failed half their forecasts, and that panic could not be sold back once purchased. He told the room that Wayne had been waiting all autumn for a second storm so his architecture could claim a victory. 3 men nodded because agreeing with power felt warmer than admitting uncertainty. On December 9th, uneasy weather sat over the basin without committing to full storm. Temperatures hovered near -10, then rose and fell in short swings, while gusts came from shifting directions, circling fences and striking doors from angles no one trusted. Wayne called that variability the most dangerous condition because it invited delay, and he spent the day moving house to house where he was allowed, helping set touch lines and showing children how to keep one hand on rope even when visibility still looked clear. Mercy stayed in the corridor lane, rechecked inventory against placement marks, and relabeled 2 shelves after condensation-blurred ink because medicine lost in dim light was medicine lost entirely. On December 10th, the reading fell to -24 by dusk, and Spindrift began moving like smoke along street level before any heavy fall began. Mercy and Wayne spent those hours converting the corridor from efficient shelter to full triage lane. They brought in extra cots from the church, lashed them to wall pegs, and numbered each station in chalk so assignments could be given fast, in bad light. Mercy prepared broth concentrate in sealed jars, 1 pint to 4 pints hot water, and lined them by date. Wayne widened the doorway threshold with a beveled plank ramp so a stretcher could pass without jolting lungs already raw from cold air. Near sunset, Deputy Aaron Pike came with frost on his collar and asked for 2 spare rope coils for emergency patrol. Wayne gave him 3, plus a brass whistle and clear instructions on knot spacing for gloved hands. Pike accepted with a grim nod and said he should have learned the method in November. He was still proud, still formal, but the mockery had left his voice. 10 minutes later, Thomas Reed arrived carrying his grandson's broken mitten and requested stitching wax and 2 dry pairs from Mercy's reserve. She provided both and pressed him to move the child to the Graham's north cabin before night. Reed thanked her and said he would return after securing his own stove wall. He didn't move immediately. By full dark on December 10th, Cloud cover sealed the basin, and a north pressure line struck with a sound like long timber ripping across nails. The corridor walls shuddered once, held, then settled into that deep, steady vibration Wayne associated with sustained force rather than passing gusts. Across Sage Hollow, lamps winked behind iced glass, some bright, some already dim. At Kincaid's store, 2 lanterns burned late as last-minute buyers bargained over the remaining flour at prices few could meet. At Folly Alley, renamed by no one yet but relied upon by many already, Mercy tied her apron, checked each stove draft, and opened the intake ledger to a fresh page while Wayne tightened his coat belt, took up the lead rope, and stepped into a night that had begun to erode roads again. The lead rope snapped straight in Wayne's gloved hand as soon as he cleared the corridor door, not from breakage but from wind load, and the first 10 paces to Willow Lane took him twice their usual time, because each step had to be planted, tested, and then weighted while snow moved not downward but across, sharp as grit against his cheeks. Deputy Aaron Pike followed on the second line with a lantern hooded to a narrow slit, the flame flattening each time a gust struck from the north. Behind them, Mercy closed the outer door, waited 3 breaths, and closed the inner door, preserving what heat they had built for the sick who were already on cots in the south cabin. By the second hour after dark on December 10th, the storm had crossed from violence to system. Temperatures fell from -24 at dusk to -29 before midnight, and wind that had begun as hard gusts settled into a sustained force measured later at near 62 miles per hour by the rail anemometer after it was dug from drift. No bell rang in town because no one could hear one. Sound was consumed by moving snow and timber strain. Wayne and Pike reached the Reed place first, following the chalk marks Wayne had laid on door frames during the false calm. Tomas Reed opened to a 6-inch gap, face white with frost at his beard, grandson wrapped in 2 blankets behind him. Wayne gave plain instructions in 12 words. Child first, rope on, keep left hand fixed, no stopping for dropped items. Reed nodded, passed the boy forward to Pike, and turned back once for his coat rack. Wayne caught his arm and pulled him out by the sleeve. The door shut behind them and disappeared within minutes under fresh accumulation. Across Sage Hollow, houses built for ordinary winters began failing by sequence. Lean-tos lost roof boards where nails had been set shallow in green wood. Window putty cracked and surrendered glass. Chimneys with loose mortar drew backward and poured smoke into single-room interiors where families had sealed vents against draft. 2 barns near the wash lost ridge sections under drift weight that had formed unevenly in the crosswind. A freight shed by the rail spur shed its south wall before dawn. Every failure pushed more souls into motion through conditions that punished motion itself. At Kincaid's Mercantile, prosperity showed its fragility in one night. His front windows, broad and admired in autumn, iced from within and then starred at the corners. Shelves that had once signaled abundance now stood broken by urgency. Flour bins scraped clean, coffee tins gone. Lamp oil crate lids split where crowbars had been used in argument and haste. Kincaid tried to keep private sales through the evening, taking cash at storm rates for what remained. But by midnight he had little left to sell and no means to fetch more. The roads were erased. Rail service had stopped entirely west of Granite Falls. His ledger still held numbers. Numbers did not burn in a stove. Near 1 in the morning on the 11th of December, a runner from Willow Lane staggered to the Graham's corridor and reported a barn roof collapse behind the Harmon property with stock pinned and 2 men missing from a feed run. Wayne formed 3 rope teams at once, not by social standing but by endurance and obedience. Team 1, led by Wayne, carried hatchets, pry bar, and 2 stretchers. Team 2, led by Pike, carried lantern, spare rope, and wool wraps. Team 3, led by Seth Brannick, carried shovel heads and grain sacks to clear airway pockets if timber shifted. Mercy remained at the corridor, assigning intake order, rotating stove drafts, and marking each departure and return time in the ledger, so no team vanished without immediate search. The walk to the Harmon barn measured less than 300 yards in fair weather. In that night it became a campaign. Drifts reached chest height at fence turns. The rope line vanished twice under sloughing snow and had to be found by probing with shovel handles. At one point, Wayne ordered all three teams prone for 20 seconds while a gust front passed, because standing men were being pushed sideways off their own track. They reached the barn to find the east half of the roof down, rafters sheared where rot had gone unnoticed through dry months, one mule screaming under a beam, two hands trapped to the waist, but alive. Rescue in that cold required arithmetic more than force. Wayne set two men to cut a relief notch rather than lift the full load. Pike crawled under the fallen ridge with a rope cinched at his waist, looped the trapped mule's harness, and shouted for pull timing over wind that swallowed half the words. The first man came free with a dislocated shoulder. The second came free with one leg useless below the knee and lips already turning blue. The mule kicked once, then went still enough to be dragged. By the time they began return transit, snow had filled their inbound track completely. Mercy saw the first lantern appear at the corridor gap just after 3 in the morning. She had broth already salted, dry wool laid in sequence, and 2 cots pre-warmed with wrapped stones. Intake moved exactly as written. Wet stripped in corridor, extremities warmed in cloth, hot liquid in small measures, then transfer by need. The north cabin remained sleeping quarters for those who could recover with rest. The south cabin took the injured, the fevered, and those whose lungs rattled after exposure. Mercy kept the doors offset and never allowed both to stand open together. The discipline held heat when firewood alone would not have. By noon on the 11th of December, the official reading at the post office wall was minus 31 degrees, though few could reach it to see. The storm entered its deadliest push that afternoon. Houses nearest open lots drifted to eave height on windward sides. A church shed door was buried shut. Stock that had not been moved to lee cover froze standing at fence lines. The town did not suffer equally, and those inequalities had names. Thomas Reed died 10 steps from his own door at dusk on the 11th. He had delivered his grandson safely to the Grahams before noon, accepted dry mittens from Mercy, and insisted on returning home for his daughter-in-law and stoveplate key, saying the iron grate would fail if left unchecked. On the return route, he gave his heavy coat to the boy when the child began shuddering uncontrollably. He tied the rope correctly, kept left hand fixed as instructed, and still did not make the final distance when a cross gust drove him to one knee, and cold took what strength remained. Wayne and Brannock found him by lantern after dark, body angled toward the latch he could not reach. The grandson survived. Reed did not. Deputy Aaron Pike died before dawn on December 12th, in the same lane where he had distributed warning notices in fair weather. During a second rescue run to the collapsed barn, the trapped mule panicked and twisted the shared line around a broken post, threatening to drag 2 men off footing into a drifted culvert. Pike cut the jammed rope with his clasp knife, shoved the nearest hand clear, and called for a spare line. A gust wall hit as he turned back. His lantern vanished first, then his outline. Wayne and 4 others searched with linked ropes until sunrise without result. Pike's body was recovered 2 days later against a buried fence, whistle still on its cord, gloves frozen to the rope end he had tried to retie. Elsie Harmon, age 9, died on December the 14th in the south cabin, not from wound but from lung fever that set in after the barn collapse night, when she had been pulled through blowing snow in soaked clothes and spent too long breathing coal dust and smoke. Mercy marked her high risk at intake: fast pulse, shallow cough, heat in the chest, and moved her behind a canvas partition near the stove's steadier draft. For 2 days, Mercy and Mrs. Brannock rotated steam bowls, mustard poultices, willow bark, and spooned broth at strict intervals while keeping wet garments and traffic clear of her cot space. Elsie stayed lucid long enough to ask whether the mule from their barn had lived and whether her younger brother had kept his mittens on. She died near sunset with her mother holding her hand and Mercy counting breaths that grew farther apart until they stopped. Desperation altered conduct faster than argument ever had. Men who had mocked rope lines now asked for knot lessons with shaking hands. Families who had avoided Folly Alley sent written notes pinned in cloth, requesting intake for elders, asking whether 1 cup of oats could be exchanged for lamp oil, offering labor in place of coin. The corridor between the Grahams' cabins became the one space in Sage Hollow where rank did not set order. Order was set by condition. Coldest first, youngest adults with strength to wait last. Cough separated from fracture. Smoke inhalation isolated from fever cases. Mercy's ledger pages filled edge to edge with names, temperatures, and rations issued by ounce. By December 13th, Ezra Kincaid's own position had collapsed with the illusion that had protected it. His large house had burned through coal in 6 days because broad windows bled heat and interior doors stood open by design. The remaining woodpile had iced under drifting snow. 2 hired hands had left to reach kin at Cedar Bluff and never returned. He came to the Grahams near dawn with frost-cracked hands, empty coal scuttle, and the same black ledger that had once closed accounts on families now sleeping on Mercy's cots. He stood at the corridor threshold while Brannock and Wayne hauled in a stretcher, and for several seconds no one spoke, because the wind spoke enough for all of them. Kincaid broke first, voice rough from cold and smoke. He said his stove was out, his back room held no dry fuel, and 3 souls remained in his house with 1 blanket between them. He did not offer coin. He did not ask for credit. He asked for instruction and work. Wayne took the scuttle from his hand, set it by the wood stack, and answered in terms of tasks, not history. Kincaid would shovel the lee trench to keep corridor doors clear to full swing. Kincaid would haul splitwood from stack to south cabin at 10-stick intervals. No pauses indoors until the count was met. Kincaid would sit at Mercy's table between loads and tally ration scoops, exactly as marked. 1/2 cup oats per adult serving, 1/4 cup for broth thickening, no exceptions without Mercy's word. Then Wayne sent Brannock and 2 others with a rope sled to retrieve the 3 souls from Kincaid's house. Kincaid nodded once and began shoveling before his gloves were fully tied. He slipped twice, rose twice, and kept moving. No one insulted him. No one saluted him either. Authority had shifted in Sage Hollow with no vote and no speech, from possession to competence, and the shift held because wind, hunger, and loss had made pretense too expensive. That afternoon, as daylight thinned behind blowing snow, a small group arrived at the corridor door led by Church Elder Jonas Hale, hat in both hands, scarf rimed white, with 6 families behind him carrying bedding bundles and 1 iron pot. Hale said the church stove had cracked at the seam and could not be trusted through another night. He said they had resisted coming sooner because pride had mistaken caution for accusation. He asked plainly whether the Grahams would take them in and tell them where to stand. Mercy opened the ledger to a fresh page, wrote each name, and pointed to the intake bench. Wayne handed Hale a rope coil and set him to line duty between corridor and overflow shed. No condition was named. No apology was requested. The doors opened and closed in sequence, one at a time, while the storm spent itself against sod, timber, and a 22-foot space that had been mocked as waste until it became the narrow line between the living and the dead. The doors opened and closed in sequence through that night and the next, each movement controlled by Mercy's hand signal and Wayne's count, until the corridor ceased to belong to one family and became the working heart of Sage Hollow. By dawn on December 15th, 34 souls had passed through intake in less than 18 hours, and every one of them had been taught the same rule while fingers still shook from cold. Snow stays in the passage. Wet wool stays in the passage. Breath slows before crossing into sleep. Wayne turned rescue into instruction because instruction multiplied survival faster than any single pair of arms could. He set Elder Hale and 2 ranch hands to knot practice at the south door, making them tie and untie rope loops while wearing mittens soaked in meltwater, then sent them back into the storm to rig lines for households that had refused lines in November. Mercy took charge of ration schooling with equal firmness. 1 scoop was 1 scoop, level at the rim, never heaped for friendship and never shaved for spite. She measured oats by the half cup, flour by the quarter pound, lamp oil by the ounce, and she read out loud from her ledger after each distribution, so no rumor could rewrite arithmetic. Families who had once purchased on Kincaid's favor now stood in line for broth prepared from beans bought from a freighter's widow, trout smoked in cloth salt layers, and potatoes that had held above freezing because the root trench beneath the 22-foot corridor had been lined exactly as planned. When the wind loosened just enough to see the next fence post, Wayne used the opening before anyone could mistake it for safety. He took rope sleds and salvage lists house to house and pulled the front trace himself. The town learned quickly that expensive construction failed in ways modest construction did not. Kincaid's decorative window casings warped and split from interior frost. 2 ranch homes with imported wallpaper had stove smoke trapped behind sealed parlors and could not be slept in. A new boarding house with broad central hall bled heat so quickly that ice formed on the inside of staircase rails. Meanwhile, the Grahams' plain cabins, rough-trimmed and unpainted, held because each space had one purpose and each transition had a barrier. The next push came before dusk, angling more from the west, lighter in snowfall but meaner in dry cold, and no one called it a false alarm again. Children as young as 10 walked touch lines with one hand fixed and one hand shielding their mouths. Men who had mocked Folly Alley nailed improvised baffles between sheds and kitchens. Women who had once avoided Mercy's reading table organized nighttime watch rotations in 4-hour shifts, copying her chart format on scrap crate boards. The corridor never emptied. It changed tempo. New arrivals staggered in with frozen cuffs and cracked lips. Trained neighbors followed with notes. Who had fuel for 2 nights? Who had a stovepipe gone soft at one seam? Who had a baby coughing in wet air? Mercy's pages thickened with names, temperatures, quantities, and placements. She tracked who entered by which door, who left with which assignment, who returned with thawed toes and who did not return at all. At the north threshold, she repeated the same sequence until even the stubborn could recite it half asleep. Dry, warm, broth, sleep. Wet garments barred from the sleeping cabin. No exceptions, no bargaining, no grief granted a pass through physics. Wayne enforced departures with the same unadorned discipline. Teams went out by rope, tool load, and return window. If a team ran late, he redeployed before panic could outrun calculation. In the middle of that rhythm, Ezra Kincaid worked where Wayne had first put him, shoveling drifted approaches, hauling cut wood, tallying rations under Mercy's eye. Frostbite had peeled the skin from 2 fingertips, and he wrapped them in linen torn from an old account sleeve. He did not ask for a warmer station. He waited for instruction, did the next task, and moved aside when the next intake wave arrived. People watched him in short, measuring glances while they waited for broth. No one gave him ceremonial contempt. No one offered ceremonial forgiveness. Survival had narrowed everyone's language. By the time the sky finally thinned to a hard, brittle blue and held, the town looked planed down to structure. Drifts stood shoulder high against the church wall, and higher where corners trapped spin. Main Road had to be cut in relays with double teams at the traces. 41 cabins showed structural damage ranging from split door frames to collapsed lean-tos and torn roof sections. 3 graves waited at the edge of town for ground soft enough to take a shovel. Rail service remained absent, telegraph uncertain, and outside relief still measured in rumor. Reckoning did not come as a single speech in a warm room. It came in labor, then in ledgers, then in words that could not be withdrawn. On the first clear afternoon, Ezra Kincaid carried his black account book to the corridor bench where Mercy had run intake and asked permission to sit. He looked older by 10 years, cheeks hollowed, fingertips bandaged where frostbite had taken skin. Mercy set down a sack scale and nodded once. Kincaid opened to the storm pages and read line by line the prices he had charged between 21st October and 10th December, including flour at 41 cents and then 58, kerosene withheld to cash, coal rationed by influence. His voice did not rise. It roughened and held. He said he had converted warning into profit and dependence into leverage, and that he had done it in public while claiming prudence. No one answered for several moments. Wind moved softly through the corridor roof slats above the sod walls. Then Seth Brannock stepped forward and asked what Kincaid intended to do with that admission, besides speak it. Kincaid placed a canvas pouch on the bench, then a second. He said repayment would begin at once, in coin where coin could be traced, in goods at pre-storm prices where coin had passed through too many hands. He said his surplus stock, once rail resumed, would be sold through spring at October rates, and no family account would be closed for work done under Wayne's direction. He handed Mercy a folded sheet listing each household he had overcharged, with amounts beside names. She checked it against her own storm ledger, made 2 corrections, and returned it for his signature. The changes became visible before the ink had fully dried. Flour dropped back towards standard measure. Lamp oil returned by ounce without side terms. Coal allotments were posted by household size, not by social rank. Kincaid sent 2 dray loads of milled timber to the Graham's acre and told Wayne, in view of 20 witnesses, that the lumber was payment towards 6 paired cabin builds to be taught under Graham's supervision, beginning as soon as thaw allowed proper footing. Wayne accepted the timber and assigned it immediately. 2 stacks for the Harmon widow and her son, 1 for Pike's sister, 1 for Reed's daughter-in-law, and 2 held in reserve for elders with damaged roofs. He did not preserve a ceremonial stack for himself. The social language shifted more slowly than prices, but faster than Pride expected. Some households came with full apology, formal and direct. Some came with tools and no speech at all. The phrase "Graham's Folly Alley" stopped appearing in ordinary talk and was replaced, first awkwardly and then with respect, by an instruction shouted across repair sites. Leave a Graham gap. Make it 22 feet if you can spare it, 18 if you cannot. But leave a controlled passage and double doors. The phrase carried no laughter now. When the ground gave enough to begin proper burial depth near the cottonwoods east of the wash, the town gathered without summons. Thomas Reed was laid beside his wife with his coat folded over the coffin lid before lowering at his grandson's request. Deputy Aaron Pike's whistle cord was placed in the box by Elder Hale, who said that courage had no need of witness to remain courage. Elsie Harmon was buried with her school slate, and 1 mitten kept dry from the night of the barn collapse. Mercy stood with the women nearest the front. Wayne stood with the rope teams. No speech attempted to make loss smaller than it was. The deeper reckoning came in the church while windows remained cross-braced from storm damage and stove heat reached only the first 6 pews. One by one, townsfolk named what they had said in autumn. A ranch foreman repeated his joke about charging toll in the alley and said he had taught his sons contempt as if it were masculinity. A seamstress confessed she had withdrawn her niece from Mercy's lessons to protect store credit and had nearly lost the child to fever ignorance in December. Elder Hale admitted he had wrapped social caution in religious language and called it wisdom. Kincaid spoke last among them and quoted his own line about fear dressed as craftsmanship, then said fear had not built that corridor. Discipline had. Wayne did not answer immediately. He waited until the room stilled and the stove settled. His response was measured, neither absolution nor accusation. He said their mother had taught that preparation was a duty owed forward, not a badge worn backward. He said words spoken in pride had done harm and would remain part of the town's history, whether named or hidden. He said he would not spend spring weighing who deserved instruction, because weather did not weigh deserving either. Then he set terms. Every family that built with a corridor would train 2 others in the same method before first frost. Every household would keep a written winter ledger of fuel, food, and medicine, open for inspection during hard weather. Every child above 8 would learn line walking by touch and door discipline by sequence. "If you wish to honor Reed, Pike, and Elsie," he said, "you will make their names into procedures, not speeches." No one applauded. They stood. As repair work replaced rescue work, Wayne and Mercy marked paired cabin foundations on paper and ground alike, each with measured transfer space and root trench planned before wall framing. Kincaid paid cash wages for public crews from his own reserve, then worked beside them carrying sod bricks until his healed fingers split and bled through linen wraps. Mercy reopened her reading circle with children crowded shoulder to shoulder around crateboard slates, and the curriculum was no longer contested. Letters, numbers, ration arithmetic, fire rotation, fever watch, and weather signs copied from Ino Graham's notebooks. At Mercy's insistence, the notebooks were transcribed into 2 ledgers, one kept at the Graham's cabins and one kept at the church, so no single fire could erase the method. The twin cabins remained what they had always been. Not a statement, a system. The south cabin stayed marked for lamp oil, oats, bandage cloth, and broth concentrate. The north cabin stayed for sleep, pallets set away from outer walls by 1 measured handspan. Between them, the corridor remained roofed, baffled and cleared a full door swing, 22 feet of practiced humility preserved in timber, sod, and routine. Along its interior wall hung a plain board inscribed with Ino Graham's rule in Mercy's hand: "Build for day 7, not day 1. When clouds lowered early and geese flew broken before dawn, elders told younger builders to leave the right distance between shelter and shelter, between pride and mercy, and they no longer called that space folly. 3 days after the last sentence about folly would have sounded believable to anyone, Wayne stood in the rail office beside Mercy, while station agent Lyle Benton unfolded the delayed wire packet that had finally reached Sage Hollow by hand courier from Granite Falls, the paper damp at its corners and stamped twice where relays had failed. Benton read each line aloud for the record. 3 confirmed telegraph breaks west of Cheyenne on October 21st. Primary continuity restored after roughly 3 days. Additional ice damage on December 2nd, and unstable intermittent service through January 14, 1888. No warning had been withheld from Sage Hollow. No hidden message had been ignored. The system itself had broken under weather and distance, exactly as Wayne had feared when the first line went silent. Mercy copied the dispatch into the town ledger, then set her own storm book beside it, so fuel counts, ration issues, and intake names could be compared against official dates. Kincaid had in both hands, signed as witness after Elder Hale, The paper trail that had once served pride now served memory. Before they left the office, Mercy asked Benton one practical question: whether the rail spur expected flour and coal first, or tools and cloth first. Benton answered that coal would come first if ties could be cleared by Sunday, and Wayne turned to Kincaid and said, "Then your posted rates stay where you promised until thaw." Kincaid nodded and said they would stay through spring and longer if needed. By January 19th, with daytime temperatures climbing to 11 degrees above zero for 2 afternoons in a row, Mercy called the first full accounting at the corridor bench where intake had been run in December. Families arrived with sacks, jars, and awkward care, returning what had been borrowed when return had seemed uncertain. Seth Brannick brought back the auger, honed and oiled. Mrs. Harmon returned 2 blankets and 1 ladle, then paused over the ladle handle where Elsie had scratched a shallow line with a nail in summer and asked if the mark could remain. Mercy said it would remain. Kincaid returned the quart oil can he had carried home the day his stove died, filled to the rim and wrapped in cloth to prevent spill. Wayne checked each item against Mercy's entries. Rope coils, brass whistles issued, pine pitch barrels opened, camphor tins consumed, willow bark reserve emptied, flour sacks distributed by quarter pound. Nothing vanished into rumor. Everything was named. In the same week, the strange details that had been mocked as superstition were discussed in plain technical terms at the church stove line, because experience had changed what counted as respectable knowledge. The low geese flight before dawn, the cattle standing rump to north, the ravens abandoning carrion, the double halo around weak sun, the mule refusing grain with ears pinned north, the sudden barometer drop that Ino had called iron wind. Each sign was listed on slate by Mercy and copied by 12 children and 9 adults who had once laughed at weather talk. Elder Hale asked whether those signs always meant catastrophe. Wayne answered that they did not always mean catastrophe, but they always meant preparation should begin the same day. "False alarm costs wood," he said. "Late alarm costs names." On February 2nd, when the ground near the cottonwoods was finally soft enough to take full depth without splitting iron spades, crews began preparation at the burial ground, and on February 4th, 1888, Sage Hollow held the delayed burial service for Deputy Pike, with the town in attendance and no one absent for commerce. Pike's sister, Nora, stood straight despite wind and accepted the whistle cord from Wayne in both palms, then handed it to Mercy and asked that it be hung in the corridor classroom beside the rule board so children would learn that rescue required order as much as courage. Thomas Reed's grandson, coat too large but buttoned correctly, placed his grandfather's repaired mitten on the coffin lid before lowering and looked directly at Kincaid when he did it. Kincaid held that look and did not turn away. The formal reckoning came on February 10th in the church, not because Wayne requested it, but because families requested one room where truth could be spoken without barter. The stove was packed with mixed cottonwood and coal, windows still cross-braced, benches crowded to the wall. Hale opened with names of the dead, then read the autumn remarks entered by witnesses in Mercy's hand. Graham's Folly Alley. Fear dressed as craftsmanship. Panic building. He asked those who had spoken to stand. 12 stood first. Then 3 more. Kincaid spoke before he was asked. He repeated his own words exactly, including the flour prices and the day he raised them while Wayne warned the room. He did not soften motive. "I believed control was prudence," he said. "I used debt to force agreement because agreement protected my standing. Children nearly froze while I defended a ledger." He then read each repayment amount and the date paid, including households that had not demanded coin back. Mrs. Brannick interrupted once to say her amount had been short by 12 cents. Kincaid apologized, opened his pouch, and paid 12 cents into her hand in front of everyone. No one laughed. Others followed with less polish and more weight. The ranch foreman admitted he had told his sons to avoid Mercy's lessons, so no boy would be called fearful. And one of those sons had later needed Hale's hand on a rope line to find his own door. The seamstress who had withdrawn her niece from the reading circle stood with her niece beside her and said she had chosen credit over instruction and had been wrong in a way that could have buried a child. Benton, the station agent, admitted he had treated Wayne's warning as another frontier exaggeration and had left the telegraph office early on December 2nd, delaying relay checks by hours. He did not claim those hours would have saved the line. Only that duty had been measured too lightly. When the room quieted, Hale turned to Wayne and Mercy. Mercy rose first, thin from winter labor, hands raw where lie and cold had split the skin, and said she would not answer apology with performance. She said the corridor had been built for transfer, and the town was now in another transfer. From habit to method, she placed 2 ledgers on the table, one for each side of town, and said every household would enter weekly figures from October through March for fuel remaining, food remaining, and medicine remaining. If you are ashamed, she said, prove it in numbers that keep children warm. Wayne stood beside her and rested one hand on Ino's copied notebook. His words were spare and carried across the room because no one moved while he spoke. I did not build those cabins to be right in public. I built them because my mother died in a room that mixed wet, smoke, and sleep. You have named what you said. Good. Naming is honest work, but the dead are not honored by our discomfort tonight. They are honored when this town cannot be caught unready again. He looked toward Kincaid, then to the back bench where boys who once shouted Folly Alley sat with chalk still on their fingers. I will teach any soul here. Mercy will teach any soul here. Whether you call that forgiveness is your burden, we call it obligation. By the second week of March, the first 6 paired cabin foundations were staked under Wayne's supervision and Mercy's measurements, each with 2 14 by 18 structures and transfer gaps adjusted to lot shape but never under 18 feet. Kincaid's promised timber arrived in full, invoiced at his own expense, and he worked the unloading line until his shoulders trembled. Costs were posted publicly at the church door. Sill timber $39 per set, roof boards $27, 2 used stoves averaging $13.20, hinge and latch iron $4.10, lime and sand $6, rope and eye bolts $2.35. Families pooled labor in crews of 8, rotating by lane, and no build began without a written storage plan for oats, root trench depth, door offset, and cough partition cloth. On October 3, 1897, 10 years to the day after Wayne and Mercy bought the split acre for $19, Sage Hollow counted 347 souls and 19 homes with Graham gaps, 8 with full winter corridors roofed and baffled, and 1 public corridor attached to the church shed for overflow shelter during storms. Kincaid's store still stood, but its ledgers were now audited each autumn by a 3-family committee that included 1 widow, 1 ranch hand, and 1 teacher from Mercy Circle. Flour prices were posted weekly and could not be changed during declared weather alerts without public notice and council approval. The twin cabins at the wash edge still stand. The south cabin holds shelves of labeled jars, reserve tools, and the original intake bench rubbed smooth by decades of gloves and wet sleeves. The north cabin remains sleeping quarters during drill nights. Pallets kept 1 measured handspan from outer walls because procedure outlives argument. Between them, the corridor stays clear to full door swing, 22 feet from threshold to threshold, rope pegs at chest, waist, and knee, Pike's whistle cord hanging beside Ino's rule board. Children recite the sequence before they learn cursive, Dry first, warm second, broth third, sleep fourth. Visitors ask why 2 cabins were built instead of 1. The answer is written in Mercy's hand, where every class can see it. Build for day 7, not day 1.